The pickaxe came down for the 437th time that afternoon. Marta here had been counting because counting was the only way to keep her hands moving when every muscle from her shoulder blades to her wrists screamed at her to stop. The hole was 4 feet deep now, 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and the Nebraska sky above it had turned the color of a pewter pot. She was 16 years old. She had $9. She had no father, no mother, no roof, and 31 days before the first hard frost was expected to roll down out of the Dakotas and kill anything left breathing in the open. A meadowlark called somewhere behind her in the blue stem grass, oblivious, cheerful, and entirely unhelpful. Marta wiped the grit from her lip, looked at the dark rectangle she had clawed into the earth of Custer County, Nebraska, and drove the pickaxe down again. This was September 14th, 1878. Nobody in the settlement of Broken Willow Creek, 11 miles east along the Republican River Road, believed she was going to make it to October. They weren't being cruel exactly. Frontier people learned early that sentiment didn't keep your pipes from freezing, didn't replant your burned crop, didn't drag your husband's body out from under the collapsed barn beam. Cruelty was a luxury, realism was survival. And the realism of Broken Willow Creek, assessed by men and women who had been grinding a living out of this particular piece of the high plains since 1871, was this. A 16-year-old girl alone on unclaimed bottomland with $9 and a borrowed pickaxe was not going to survive the kind of winter Nebraska routinely produced. The winter of 1856 had killed 23 settlers in the Platte River Valley. The winter of 1864 had wiped out 2 entire families over in Howard County. Whatever was coming down from Canada in 1878, the old-timers in their bones said it was going to be worse than either. But here is what those old-timers didn't know. They didn't know what Marta Hoyer knew about cold earth. They didn't know what her father had told her 3 years before he died, sitting in a rocking chair with his boot off and his frost-bitten foot wrapped in wool, talking about the winters in Württemberg when he was a boy and the way the farmhands had kept warm in the hill country by sleeping in rooms dug half into the slope behind his grandfather's barn. They didn't know that Marta had been memorizing the landscape of this particular creek bend for 8 months before she ever picked up a shovel. And they most certainly did not know, nobody knew yet, that the structure she was carving out of the Nebraska sod was about to be tested by the most savage winter the Central Plains had seen since 1857. 31 days wasn't much time, but it was, as it turned out, exactly enough. Marta Hoyer was born in 1862 in a one-room soddy 3 miles south of Kearney, Nebraska, to Heinrich and Berta Hoyer, who had come over from Württemberg in 1859 with a trunk, a milk cow, and a shared conviction that the land in the Nebraska Territory was going to be everything the immigration pamphlets promised. It wasn't, not at first. The grasshopper plague of 1874 stripped their corn to bare stalks in 2 days. The drought of 1876 turned their well to mud. Heinrich Hoyer died of pneumonia in January 1877, leaving Berta and Marta and a 160-acre homestead with a $40 lien against it from a supply merchant in Kearney. Berta Hoyer was a practical woman. She sold what she could, paid the lien, and remarried by October of that same year. A man named Otto Fichter who had a quarter section of his own and a jaw like a barn door and very little interest in a stepdaughter who, in his words, ate too much and talked back. By the spring of 1878, Berta Hoyer Fichter was dead of typhoid fever, and Otto Fichter was standing in the doorway of his soddy telling Marta that he had written to a cousin in St. Louis who might take her in, but that in the meantime she needed to be gone by the end of the week because his sister was coming to keep house and there wasn't room. Marta had listened to this speech with her hands flat against her thighs and her jaw set at an angle that her mother had always said was pure Württemberg stubbornness bred down through 5 generations. She took the $9.14 from the tin behind the flour bin, the egg money she had saved over 2 years and hidden there when she stopped trusting Otto Fichter, and she walked out into the May morning, and she did not go to St. Louis. She walked 11 miles west to Broken Willow Creek, Nebraska, population 47, where a man named Charles Rugg ran the general store and post office out of a low-frame building with a sod roof, and she asked him where the unclaimed land was. Reg, who was 52 and had come from Alsace and had a soft spot for stubborn girls on account of having 3 daughters of his own, told her about the bottomland along the South Fork. 40 acres of creek bend that nobody had filed on because the soil was heavy clay and most people thought it too low for dry farming. Marta thanked him and walked out to look at it. She spent 4 months looking at it. All summer she walked that creek bend, morning and evening, watching where the water table sat, watching how the slope faced, watching where the snow sat longest in April, and where it melted first. She wasn't ready to dig yet. She was still gathering what she needed to know. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you already know that the frontier settlers who survived weren't always the biggest or the strongest or the ones who arrived with the most money. They were the ones who asked the right questions before they picked up a shovel. And Marta Hoare, 16 years old and alone in Custer County, was asking every right question there was. If that kind of story speaks to you, the kind where quiet preparation beats loud confidence every single time, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is a channel dedicated to preserving exactly this kind of knowledge, and there are thousands of stories left to tell. Don't miss a single one. In the settlement of Broken Willow Creek, the person most vocal about Marta Hoare's prospects was a man named Earl Dressler. Earl was 44 years old, built like a railroad tie, and had been homesteading the central Nebraska plains since 1869, long enough to have buried 2 horses, 1 brother-in-law, and more crop failures than he cared to count. He was not an unkind man. He had helped 3 different neighbors rebuild after prairie fires without being asked. But Earl Dressler had spent 9 years learning what this land would and wouldn't tolerate. And what it would not tolerate, in his considered opinion, was a teenage girl trying to winter alone in a hand-dug hole with no livestock, no laid-in provisions, and no man within shouting distance. That creek bend floods, he told Charles Rigg one afternoon in late August, leaning on the post office counter with his arms crossed. It flooded in 73 and it flooded in 76. Any shelter she digs down there is going to be a swimming hole by spring melt. Rugg, who had his own doubts, nodded but said nothing. Earl's voice carried a lot of weight in Broken Willow Creek, and not without reason. He had been right about the flooding. He had been right about the late frost of 1875 killing 3 families early planting. Being right on the plains was not an academic exercise. It was the difference between eating and starving. Pastor Wilhelm Steck had a different objection. Steck was a Lutheran minister from Pennsylvania who had come west in 1872 and built a small white-painted church that sat on a low rise half a mile from the settlement like a thumb stuck up against the sky. He was not opposed to women working. His wife Agnes had done as much physical labor as any man he knew. But he was opposed to a 16-year-old girl living entirely alone on isolated land, on grounds both moral and practical. He had twice offered to write to the county home in Grand Island on Marta's behalf. Both times she had thanked him politely and changed the subject. Steck was a patient man, but patience had its limits, and by September he had started telling his congregation that someone ought to go out there and talk some sense into that Hoare girl before she got herself killed, and it was on all their consciences. Hattie Brower was the third skeptic, and in some ways the most formidable, because Hattie was a woman who had done exactly what Marta was trying to do. Built a homestead almost from nothing after her husband died of cholera in 1874, and she had opinions about how it was done correctly. Hattie was 38, raw-boned, with hands that looked like they'd been used to tighten wagon bolts, and she had inspected Marta's chosen site in early September and pronounced the soil too wet and too heavy for anything but a root cellar. The clay subsoil didn't drain right, in Hattie's view. A dugout in that kind of earth would wick moisture through the walls all winter, and a wet dugout in a Nebraska winter was just a slow way to die of lung sickness. The fourth voice belonged to Jonas Wickfield, who held notes on 3 properties in Custer County, and had been angling to acquire the Creek Bend land for 2 years on the theory that its heavy clay soil made it ideal for adobe brick production once enough settlers arrived to create a market for it. Wickfield was 31, educated, and had the smooth tongue of a man who had learned that frontier people trusted blunt speech, so he delivered his blunt speech with careful precision. He told Marta directly, in the yard of Rigg's General Store with 4 other people present, that she was going to freeze to death, that the land wasn't worth what she'd pay to file on it, and that if she had any sense, she'd take the train to St. Louis and find work in a dry goods shop. He was not being cruel either. He genuinely believed all of it. He was also, of course, hoping to acquire the land at no cost by February, but the practical advice was sincere enough. Marta listened to all four of them. She was not the kind of person who confused stubbornness with stupidity. She wrote down what they said in a small leather-covered notebook she had kept since she was 12, and she spent 3 evenings thinking about each objection before she answered it, in her notebook, in her own mind, with what she knew about the land and what she had planned. The flooding concern she addressed first, because Earl Dressler was not wrong about the history. The creek bend had flooded. What Earl didn't know, what Marta had spent 4 months learning, was exactly why. The flooding came from a low spot 40 yards upstream, where a beaver dam had partially collapsed in 1876 and been rebuilt crooked, backing water up whenever the spring snowmelt ran heavy. The beaver dam was still crooked. Marta had measured the high water mark from the 1876 flood on the cottonwood trees along the bank. The silt line was visible at 19 inches above ground level. Her dugout was going to be dug into the south-facing slope of the creek bank, with its entrance facing east and its floor set at 38 inches below grade, high enough that even the worst flood on record wouldn't reach it, low enough to access the stable temperature of the earth. She'd also, quietly, over 3 August evenings, pulled enough of the crooked beaver dam apart to let it drain down to a more natural angle. She didn't mention that part to anyone. The wet clay objection from Hattie Brower was the one that had given her the most to think about. Hattie was right that heavy clay wicked moisture. What Hattie hadn't factored in was that Marta intended to line the walls. Not with wood, she didn't have money for lumber, but with a layer of dry grass packed tight between the raw earth wall and an inner skin of woven willow withies, plastered on the inside face with a mixture of the same clay soil, fine ash from burned prairie grass, and a small amount of animal fat. That combination, earth, ash, and fat, was something her father had described from his grandfather's hill country barns in Württemberg. The ash made the plaster slightly alkaline. The fat waterproofed the surface. The grass layer acted as an insulating air gap. It wasn't a new idea. It was an old idea from the other side of an ocean, transplanted to Nebraska sod, and it was going to work. So she dug. The pickaxe broke the crust. The iron spade moved the broken earth. She worked from first light until she couldn't see her hands, which in September on the central Nebraska plains meant roughly 14 hours a day. Her food was cornmeal mush, dried beans from a 10-pound sack she'd bought at Rugg's for $0.38, and whatever she could pull from the creek. Catfish, crayfish, a snapping turtle that gave her 4 days of solid eating. She had spent her 914 with the precision of a general allocating ammunition before a siege. The full accounting, recorded in that leather notebook: $0.38 for dried beans, $0.22 for a 5-pound bag of cornmeal, $0.15 for a paper of needles and a spool of heavy thread, $1. 10 for a used iron stove lid and 3 feet of stovepipe, purchased from a departing settler at Rueg's store. $0.65 for 10 pounds of rough-cut nails. $0.40 for a ball of wire. $0.25 for a bottle of coal tar to treat the roof timbers. $0.18 for 2 pounds of tallow candles. $0.50 for a wool blanket, used, purchased from Hattie Brower herself in a transaction that Hattie completed with the expression of a woman buying a coffin for someone still breathing. That left her $5. 31, which she kept knotted in a handkerchief inside her boot for emergencies, and which she intended not to touch. The timber for the roof came from the creek, cottonwood poles, green cut, 6 to 8 inches at the base, harvested from the thickets half a mile upstream. She cut 16 of them and dragged them by hand, each one a separate trip, over 2 days. The poles went across the top of the dugout, spanning the 8-foot width, laid close together, spiked with her cheap nails into a log sill on either side. Over the poles went 6 inches of dry grass, packed tight. Over the grass went the sod she had cut from the top of the excavation, blocks 18 inches square, 4 inches thick, stacked like bricks in 2 layers with the grass side down, the joints offset. Over the sod went another layer of dry grass, and over that, finally, a thin topping of clay slurry that would shed rain and, once it froze, form a nearly airtight cap. The door was a willow withy frame filled with more woven grass and covered on the outside with a piece of canvas she'd cut from a flour sack, coated in the coal tar. It wasn't beautiful. It was approximately R11 in insulation value by modern calculations. Not that Marta Hoare had any concept of R values. But she had her father's words in her memory and her own 4 months of watching the land, and she knew this. The earth at 3 feet below grade in Custer County, Nebraska, maintained a temperature of between 48 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Her floor was at 38 inches below grade. Even with no heat source whatsoever, the interior of that dugout would never drop below freezing. With even a small fire, it would hold 60 degrees against temperatures that would kill a man in the open in an hour. The stove was improvised from 3 flat limestone rocks she had carried up from the creek bed, each one weighing between 40 and 55 pounds, arranged in a U-shape with the iron stove lid she'd bought sitting across the top. She had fashioned a chimney flue from her 3 feet of stovepipe and a length of clay-packed willow sections above that, angled slightly to draw. The whole thing occupied the northeast corner of the dugout, which put it at the uphill end, drawing cold air in from the entrance at the east and pulling warm air up through the flue. It wasn't a manufactured stove. It was 1,000 years of human understanding about fire and airflow, reassembled from creek stones and second-hand hardware in a hole in the Nebraska ground. She moved in on October 9, 1878. The interior measured 8 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling height of 6 feet at the ridge. She had dug the floor down an additional 24 inches after the initial excavation to gain headroom without raising the roof profile. The walls were plastered. The floor was tamped earth, covered in overlapping layers of dry grass and her one wool blanket. A single tallow candle on a limestone shelf gave light. By the standards of frontier Nebraska in 1878, it was not comfortable. By the standards of sleeping outdoors in a Nebraska winter, it was remarkable. Charles Rugg saw her on October 12th when she came in to trade 6 catfish for a half-pound of salt, and he told her she looked thin but not dead, which was the closest thing to a compliment Broken Willow Creek had on offer in October. He also told her, with the careful, neutral tone of a man delivering bad news to a person who'd made their choice, that the weather readers, the ones who watched the geese and the woolly bear caterpillars and the thickness of the corn husks, were saying this was going to be a heavy winter. How heavy, nobody was sure. But the geese had come through 3 weeks early, flying low and fast, and the old Norwegian farmer up on the ridge north of town had told his son to double his firewood. The Norwegian was 71 years old and had been reading the Nebraska sky since 1863. He'd only been wrong twice. Marta bought her salt, walked the 11 miles back to the creek bend, and spent the next 8 days in a state of focused, methodical preparation that she would later describe to Charles Rugg's daughter, who wrote it down, which is how we know any of this, as the same feeling as knowing a big storm is coming and being unable to stop it, so you just make sure every single thing you can control is controlled. She extended her fuel supply. Cottonwood was poor burning wood, hot for a short time and fast to char through, but she had no choice. She cut and stacked 60 bundles of it, each bundle 18 inches in diameter, tied with twisted grass rope, stacked against the south wall of the dugout where the slope would shed rain away from them. She added to this an innovation that Earl Dressler, had he known about it, might actually have respected. She dug a second smaller pit, 6 feet across and 3 feet deep, 8 feet from the dugout entrance, and filled it with dried prairie grass compressed into tight rounds the size of dinner plates. Those grass cakes, she had calculated, burned slower than loose wood and gave off a steady low heat well suited to stretching a fire over a long cold night. The technique was one she had read about in a book of German agricultural notes that her father had brought from Württemberg and that she had memorized almost entirely before Otto Fichter used it to start his cook fire one morning, describing how farmers in the Swabian Alps had burned compressed grass and dung cakes during the worst winters of the early 1800s when timber was scarce. She laid in food. Without money to spend at Rugg's and without a rifle for large game, she had a rusted single-shot .32 caliber pistol with 6 cartridges, which she was saving for genuine emergencies and nothing else. Her winter larder was going to depend on what she could trap, dry, and store before the freeze. She had spent September setting snares along the creek bank, 3 loop-wire rabbit snares and 2 figure-4 deadfall traps baited with dried apple peel. In the 6 weeks between moving in and the first real freeze, those traps and the creek itself produced 14 rabbits, 9 catfish, 4 channel cats that ran better than 2 pounds apiece, 2 snapping turtles, and 1 unlucky beaver who had apparently not learned from the fate of his dam. She smoked everything she could over a slow cottonwood fire, packed the smoked meat and dry grass inside a clay-sealed pot she made herself from creek clay, and fired in her stone stove, and stored it in the earth shelf she had dug into the north wall of the dugout, the coldest wall pressed against the deep earth, where it would keep for months. She gathered rose hips, found a wild plum thicket half a mile west with a late crop still clinging to the branches, dried 2 pounds of them. She dug cattail roots from the creek shallows, dried and pounded them into a coarse flour. She gathered 6 pounds of late hickory nuts from the grove on the east side of the creek bend, and stored them in a dry willow basket hung from a roof timber, out of the reach of mice. By November 1st, 1878, Marta Horer had in her possession approximately 40 pounds of smoked and dried meat and fish, 6 pounds of cattail flour, 2 pounds of dried plums and rose hips, 3 pounds of hickory nuts, 7 pounds of dried beans from her original stock, 4 pounds of cornmeal, a ½ pound of salt, 60 bundles of cottonwood fuel, plus the compressed grass cakes, 3 tallow candles remaining, 1 wool blanket, her pistol and its 6 cartridges, 9 snares and deadfall traps set within a quarter mile of the dugout entrance, 4 pounds of clay plaster remaining for repairs, her leather notebook, 3 pages still blank, and the 531 in the boot, untouched. By modern nutritional calculations, assuming careful rationing, that food supply was sufficient for a 115-pound young woman doing moderate physical labor for approximately 90 days. The expected length of the 1878-79 Nebraska winter, at the latitude of Custer County, was roughly 100 to 110 days of sustained below-freezing temperatures. The margin was thin, but it existed. Earl Dressler rode out to the creek bend on November 3rd, partly out of stubbornness. He had told 3 people she'd be back in Broken Willow Creek by October, and he wanted to see if he was right, and partly because, if he was honest with himself, he had been sleeping somewhat poorly since September, thinking about that girl out there alone. He found the dugout sunk neatly into the south-facing bank, invisible except for the low, sod-covered mound of its roof and the thin trickle of smoke from the clay chimney. He dismounted, walked to the door, and called out. Marta invited him in. He had to duck through the low entrance. He stood inside for a moment without speaking, taking in the plastered walls, the stone stove radiating a steady, comfortable heat, the smoked meat hanging from the roof timbers, the organized shelves of clay pot stores, the neat bedding, the tallow candle throwing a warm circle of light. It was 39 degrees outside. Inside the dugout, his best guess was 62 degrees, maybe 65. He had been homesteading for 9 years, and he had never in 9 years been that warm in a structure with that little fire burning. He stood there with his hat in his hands for a long moment. Then he said, "Your roof's going to need more sod before the first hard snow." Marta handed him a cup of hot water with a rosehip steeping in it and said she'd been thinking the same thing. They discussed the roof for 45 minutes. Earl Dressler left with an expression on his face that was somewhere between respect and the particular discomfort of a man recalibrating a fixed opinion. Now, before we get to what happened next, and what happened next was the kind of thing that turns a survival story into a legend, I want you to do something. If you've watched this far and you found yourself thinking about the preparation, the details, the quiet competence of a 16-year-old girl alone on the Nebraska plains, this channel exists to document exactly this kind of story, exactly this kind of knowledge. Subscribe right now and help keep it alive. These stories deserve to be heard. The winter arrived in Custer County, Nebraska on November 19, 1878. Not a soft arrival, not a gradual cooling. One day the sky was iron gray and the wind was out of the northwest at 15 miles an hour, and the temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The next morning, Marta pushed open her door against a foot of new snow and a wind that was already reading. By the wool strip barometer she had rigged to the south-facing roof, a trick she had learned from her father, who had learned it from his grandfather, which was a length of raw wool hung at a known angle that stiffened and curled predictably as the barometric pressure dropped, reading a pressure drop that she had never seen before in her 16 years of watching Nebraska's sky. She secured the door with a second lashing she had prepared in October. She checked her fuel supply, her food, her water barrel. She had filled 2 clay-sealed wooden barrels with creek water in late October and stored them in the deep earth shelf where they would stay liquid, and she built up her fire to its maximum efficient setting. A bed of coals from the slow-burning grass cakes, topped with a single small cottonwood bundle, fed every 4 to 5 hours. At that rate, She had calculated. Her fuel would last 92 days. What no one in Broken Willow Creek, including the 71-year-old Norwegian farmer and his doubled firewood, had fully anticipated was the sequence of storms that followed. The first blizzard deposited 23 inches of snow between November 19th and 21st and drove temperatures to -17 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill, though no one in 1878 had a formal formula for wind chill, was effectively lethal for any creature in the open within 20 minutes. The snow sealed Marta's door from the outside, which she had also prepared for, with a hand-carved wooden shovel stored inside the dugout for exactly this purpose. She dug out each morning to check her snares, moving quickly, never more than 300 yards from the entrance, always watching the northwest sky for the next system coming in. In Broken Willow Creek, the situation was significantly less comfortable. The settlement's buildings, frame construction mostly with sod roofs and minimal insulation, had been adequate for average Nebraska winters. This was not an average Nebraska winter. Earl Dressler's barn lost a section of roof on November 22nd under the snow load. Pastor Steck's church developed a crack in its south wall on November 25th. More seriously, the Adler family, 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 9, and their parents Carl and Liesel Adler, had their stovepipe freeze solid on November 23rd, backing smoke into the house and sending all 5 of them to Rueg's general store for refuge until Carl could clear it. The second storm hit December 2nd, 19 more inches. Temperature dropped to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. This was, by the accounting of the settlers who had been in Custer County since 1871, beyond anything they had experienced. The Norwegian farmer, whose name was Lars Torgerson and whose judgment Earl Dressler had described as infallible, came down from his ridge on horseback on December 3rd to tell anyone who would listen that the last time he had seen a winter like this was 1857 on the Minnesota prairie, and that 2 settlements near him in Minnesota in 1857 had lost people to cold exposure. He was 71 years old, and he said it without melodrama, the way frontier people delivered serious news, which made it considerably more frightening than shouting would have. The third storm came December 14th. Only 11 inches this time, but the temperature behind it, December 15th, 1878, reached -31 degrees Fahrenheit in the early morning hours. Charles Rueg recorded it in his store ledger, -31 degrees Fahrenheit with a northwest wind at an estimated 30 miles an hour. The only structures in Broken Willow Creek that were maintaining livable interior temperatures that morning were the general store, which Rueg had built with triple-thick sod walls, and 11 miles away on the creek bend, a 16-year-old girl's hand-dug earth shelter with its 4-inch sod roof and its plastered walls and its stone stove burning a single cottonwood bundle every 5 hours. Marta Heer's dugout, on December 15th at the lowest point of the overnight cold, maintained an interior temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. She had checked it with the only thermometer in her possession, a small glass tube with a colored alcohol column, purchased at Rueg's in August for $0.19. The one expenditure she hadn't listed in her budget because she considered it essential enough to be outside the accounting. 52 degrees. Outside, -31. A differential of 83 degrees, produced by nothing more than the insulating mass of the surrounding earth, the sealed construction of the walls and roof, and a fire burning approximately 2 pounds of fuel every 5 hours. The thermal mass of the earth itself was doing the heavy work. The Swabian farmers of her father's grandfather's time had understood this. Marta Heer understood this. The earth was the furnace. The fire was just the pilot light. She was not comfortable. She was alone, and 16, and the isolation in those weeks had a quality that she later described in that leather notebook as, like being at the bottom of a well and knowing the well is good and solid, but still not being able to see the top. She rationed her candles to 3 hours per evening, spending them reading her father's agricultural notes by the light. She set and checked her snares every morning in a snow depth that reached her thighs by December's 3rd week. She caught 6 more rabbits and 1 large coyote. The coyote she skinned carefully, dried the meat, and added the pelt to her bedding, which by mid-December consisted of her wool blanket, a layer of dried grass 8 inches deep, and 2 rabbit skins she had tanned roughly with wood ash and tallow. The coyote fur over the top of it brought the system's thermal value to something equivalent to a modern rated 15-degree sleeping bag, though again, Marta had no such reference point. She only knew that she was sleeping warm. Christmas Day, 1878. The temperature rose briefly to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which felt, by that point in the winter, almost tropical. Marta celebrated by eating a larger portion of smoked catfish than her rationing schedule allowed and by writing in her notebook for 2 straight hours, in small, precise German script letters that would eventually cover 40 of the remaining 42 pages. She wrote about the construction of the dugout. She wrote about what had worked and what hadn't. The chimney draft had been too strong in high winds and needed a stone damper that she had improvised in November, and the door frame had warped in the early freeze and needed rebracing. She wrote about her father and her mother. She wrote about Otto Fichter with a restraint that said more than fury would have. She wrote, at the bottom of the December 25th entry, the following sentence, which Charles Rugg's daughter transcribed. Father said the earth keeps faith with those who keep faith with it. I begin to believe he was right. The fourth storm came January 3, 1879. 16 inches of new snow on top of the existing pack, which had not melted since November. The total snow depth in the open prairie reached 44 inches by January 5th. Movement outside was essentially impossible without snowshoes, which Marta had made in December from cottonwood frames and woven willow withies. Not elegant, not entirely effective, but functional enough to let her reach her nearest snares. The creek had frozen solid by December 1st, which eliminated fish but also eliminated the flooding risk Earl Dressler had worried about. The frozen ground and frozen creek made the structure, paradoxically, more stable. The sod roof had been covered by 16 inches of snow since late November, adding weight, but also insulation. A snow layer of 6 inches or more on a sod roof is the equivalent, in thermal resistance, of an additional 2 inches of packed earth. By January, Marta's roof was effectively buried under 22 inches of snow and ice, and the interior temperature on the coldest nights was holding at 49 to 51 degrees Fahrenheit, even when her fire burned low overnight. In Broken Willow Creek, January was grim. 2 settlers had gone to stay with family in Kearney after the 3rd storm. The Adler children had persistent coughs that Liesel Adler was treating with lard poultices and prayer, neither of which Steck nor the frontier medicine of 1878 could substantially improve upon. Jonas Wickfield had ridden east to Grand Island in November to wait out the winter, and had written a letter back to Rugg in December, expressing, in his careful, educated language, exactly no concern about Marta Hoyer's situation, since he expected to find the land vacant and available in the spring. Earl Dressler had not been out to the creek bend since November 3rd. He had thought about it. He had thought about it quite a lot. He told his wife Agnes on December 20th that the girl was probably fine. Agnes Dressler, who had been listening to her husband's assessments of other people's prospects for 18 years, said nothing with an expression that said quite a lot. On January 19, 1879, something happened that nobody in Broken Willow Creek expected. The cold broke, briefly, not a thaw, exactly, but a 3-day window of temperatures between 15 and 22 degrees Fahrenheit that felt, after 2 months of the worst winter in living memory, like a gift. And into Broken Willow Creek on January 20th, 1879, walked Marta Hoyer, on foot. 11 miles through 4-foot snowdrifts on her cottonwood frame snowshoes. She arrived at Rugg's General Store at 2 in the afternoon, knocked the snow off her boots with a stick, and walked in looking thin and bronzed by fire smoke and entirely alive. Charles Rugg stared at her for a long moment. He later wrote that she looked like a woman considerably older than 16 and somewhat amused by the world. She put 6 smoked rabbits on the counter, which she had trapped in the days before the cold break, and asked what Rugg would give her for them. He gave her 0.65 and a cup of coffee and told her to sit down. Within an hour, Earl Dressler was there. Within 2 hours, Pastor Steck. Within 3, Hattie Brower, who arrived with a plate of cornbread and said not a word until she sat down across from Marta and then said, "Tell me about the walls." Marta told her about the walls. She told her about the grass insulation layer and the ash and fat plaster. She told her about the thermal mass principle. Not in those words. She didn't have those words, but in practical terms that every person in that room could follow. The earth is warm 3 feet down. The fire only has to bridge the gap between what the earth gives and what you need, and if your walls are sealed properly, the earth's warmth bleeds through them all night, while the fire keeps the air temperature up. She told them about the compressed grass cakes, the smoke-preserved meat, the snow-insulated roof. She drew a cross-section of the dugout in the margin of Rug's order book with a stub of pencil, labeling the layers. Earl Dressler watched her draw it and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I've been out here 9 years." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The practical consequences of that afternoon's conversation were not small. Earl Dressler spent the remaining weeks of January modifying his barn's roof drainage using the same approach Marta had used on the Beaver Dam, adjusting rather than fighting the natural water flow. Hattie Brower used Marta's ash and fat plaster formula on her spring root cellar walls and reported in April that for the first time in 5 years, the cellar had stayed genuinely dry through the melt. Pastor Steck, to his considerable credit, asked Marta Horer to speak at a community meeting in February about winter preparation for the following year, and then he personally drafted a letter to the county land office in Broken Bow, asserting that the South Fork Creek Bend land had been in continuous productive occupation since September 1878, and recommending that the claim be recognized. The letter worked. Marta filed her formal homestead claim in March 1879. Jonas Wickfield arrived back in Broken Willow Creek in April of 1879 to find a young woman in legal possession of the Creek Bend land he had been planning to acquire, a community that had spent the winter learning her building techniques, and a general opinion of himself that had declined considerably during his absence. He sold his notes on the other 3 properties by summer and left Custer County. Nobody wrote down where he went. The winter of 1878-79 killed 11 people in Custer County, Nebraska, according to the county records in Broken Bow. 4 of them were travelers caught in the open. 3 were elderly settlers whose structures failed. 4 were from causes secondary to the cold. Illness made worse by inadequate shelter. A house fire started when a family burned furniture for warmth and lost control of it. Marta Horer, 16 years old, alone on a creek bend, building with $9 and her father's memories and 4 months of careful observation, was not among them. Her dugout survived the winter without significant structural damage. The roof required 40 minutes of repair in April, where one corner section had settled under the snowmelt weight. The plastered walls showed no moisture penetration. The stone stove had cracked one of its limestone slabs in a severe cold snap in January, but remained functional. She had come through the 112-day hard freeze period with 14 pounds of food remaining, mostly hickory nuts and dried beans, and $11.30 in cash, having sold smoked rabbit and catfish at Riggs on her 2 trips in during the January thaw and again in February. She had started with $9. She had ended with more. Hattie Brower came out to the dugout in May 1879, when the prairie grass was coming in green and the creek was running clear, and spent a full day examining the construction in detail. She walked the perimeter, tapped the walls, measured the roof thickness, studied the chimney angle. When she finished, she sat down outside in the spring sunshine and looked at Marta for a while without speaking. Then she said, "My Henry built our soddy in 3 weeks with 4 other men and a borrowed team. You did this alone." It wasn't quite an apology, and it wasn't quite a compliment. On the frontier, that was roughly the same thing. What Marta Horer had done was not magic. It was not even particularly new, not in any global historical sense. The Chinese Loess cave dwellers of Shaanxi province had been living in earth-sheltered homes for more than 6 centuries, maintaining stable interior temperatures through brutal northern China winters using exactly the same thermal mass principle. The Irish had cut peat into their hillside homes for 1,000 years. The Anatolian plateau settlers of ancient Turkey had built below-grade dwellings that survived climate swings that would have shattered wood frame construction. The knowledge was not lost. It had just traveled a long way, gotten scattered across languages and generations and oceans, and reassembled itself, in a leather notebook, in a girl's careful memory, in the Creek Bend soil of Custer County, Nebraska, when it was needed most. The practical community impact persisted for years. By the summer of 1880, 3 other families in the Broken Willow Creek area had built earth-bermed additions to their existing structures using Marta's wall construction method, and one family, the Adlers, whose children's winter coughs had troubled everyone, had converted their primary dwelling to a partially buried design after Carl Adler spent a full week at the Creek Bend in June 1879, helping Marta expand her dugout into a second room and learning, in the process, more about building with Earth than he had absorbed in 7 years on the prairie. Lars Torgerson, the 71-year-old Norwegian, came down from his ridge in July 1879 expressly to meet Marta, sat in her dugout for 2 hours drinking creek water with Rose Hips, and told her at length about the Norwegian underground structures called torvus, turf houses, that his own grandfather had inhabited in the mountains above Trondheim. He left saying she had good old knowledge and new hands, which Earl Dressler told his wife Agnes was the highest compliment Lars had ever given anyone in 8 years of acquaintance. The leather notebook, as far as anyone knows, was given by Marta Hoer to Charles Rugg's daughter, a girl named Anna, who was 12 in 1879 and who found Marta Hoer approximately the most compelling person she had ever encountered. In 1881, when Marta left Custer County to join a larger homestead settlement farther west, Anna Reg Holm, as she was later known, kept the notebook and transcribed significant portions of it in her own diary. That transcription survived. The original notebook did not, lost somewhere in the Holm family's movements across Nebraska over the following decades. What remains, in Anna Rug Holm's careful handwriting, is enough. The construction details, the food stores, the temperature records, the philosophical notes made by candlelight on Christmas night. Enough to understand what was accomplished and how. What strikes the modern reader, the researcher who finds Anna's diary in a county historical archive, or the reader encountering this story now, is not the hardship. Hardship was the standard condition of frontier Nebraska in 1878. What strikes is the quality of the thinking. The 4 months of observation before the first shovel stroke, the careful accounting of $9 into 17 line items, the written down responses to each skeptic's objection before she lifted a tool in answer. The temperature records kept on a borrowed thermometer. This was not improvisation. This was deliberate, methodical preparation by someone who had correctly identified the variables, understood the system, and trusted the math. She was 16. She had $9. She was right. There is a concept in modern building science called passive survivability, the ability of a structure to maintain habitable conditions for its occupants, even in the complete absence of external energy inputs, mechanical systems, or emergency services. It is considered an advanced and somewhat radical idea in contemporary architecture. Researchers who study it cite experimental earth-sheltered homes built in the 1970s and 1980s, passive solar designs, rammed earth construction. Almost none of the academic literature on the subject references the homesteaders of the 1860s, 1880s who figured it all out in real time, under conditions of genuine mortal consequence, with hand tools and borrowed pickaxes and $9. But the principle they arrived at was identical. The earth is warm. The earth is insulating. The earth keeps faith with those who keep faith with it. Marta Hoer was not the only person who understood this. She was not even the first. But she is one of the clearest examples in the historical record of what that understanding, applied by one person alone, with minimal resources, under maximum pressure, could actually produce. A 16-year-old girl kicked out with $9 and a memory. A 112-day blizzard season. One hand-dug shelter. 11 people dead in the county. Marta Hoer, alive, with 14 pounds of provisions left and a notebook full of careful observations about the world. That notebook, even in its transcribed fragment, contains a sentence that Lars Torgerson might have approved of, and that Earl Dressler, in his later years, reportedly quoted more than once to settlers who came asking him for winter advice. It was written on February 8, 1879, during the last of the 4 major storms, while Marta was alone in the dugout with the snow sealed 2 feet above her door, and the temperature outside approaching -25 degrees Fahrenheit, and the interior holding steady at 53 degrees, with a fire burning no larger than a campfire. She wrote, "People say the earth is hard, but it has been holding warmth since before any of us were born, and it will hold it long after we are gone. The question is not whether the earth will keep you warm. The question is whether you will let it." If that sentence stays with you, if you find yourself thinking about what it means to work with the natural world instead of against it, to trust the knowledge that gets passed down through generations across oceans and languages and centuries, then this is the channel for you. Subscribe right now. Join the thousands of people who come here to make sure these stories don't disappear. The frontier had 1,000,000 of them. We've barely started telling them. And hit that like button on your way. It's a small thing, but it tells us this kind of story matters to you, and it helps us keep going. The world of 1878 had no insulation ratings, no passive house certifications, no building codes, no FEMA emergency preparedness guidelines, and no mechanism whatsoever for a 16-year-old girl alone on unclaimed Creek Bend land to call for help if things went wrong. It had earth and grass and stone and the accumulated wisdom of every culture that had ever survived a cold winter in a poor country. Marta Huer had all of those things. She also had her father's voice in her memory, a leather notebook with 3 blank pages left, and the particular stubbornness that 5 generations of Württemberg farmers had apparently bred into their descendants as reliably as they'd bred the color of their eyes. In Custer County, Nebraska, in the winter of 1878-79, that turned out to be enough.